All right, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming today. We had a few technical difficulties in the beginning of starting this live stream, but they were resolved and we got them all sorted out, and so we're starting. And today's intelligence briefing is particularly interesting because there's so much happening in the world that I need to be able to tell people that are new to Farsight where we are and why what we do is super important, and also to give people who have been following us a long time an inside information into what's happening and what's actually coming across. So let me begin by saying that the beginning of this intelligence briefing is going to be up as sort of the Farsight Weekly on YouTube as a recording, but the full intelligence briefing with all of the deep stuff will be on farsightprime.com. But the beginning is going to be like the Farsight Weekly, which comes out every week, that keeps people informed of what's been going on. So let me talk a little bit about what we do here at Farsight. And for those of you who have been with us for a long while and know everything about us, just be patient just for a few minutes while I sort of introduce what we do to a new audience, because things are going to be happening this month that are going to be bringing new people in larger numbers. So what we do here at Farsight is called remote viewing. And remote viewing is a mental technique. It originally came out of the U.S. military. It's used for espionage purposes. It still is used by the military, despite the fact that the military officially says that they closed down the official program and they promise never to start it up again. If you believe that, then we've got some swampland to sell you. So the remote viewing stuff remote viewing works. The military knows it works. And what it is, it's a mental procedure with that very highly trained people can use to perceive across time and space and record that stuff down. At Farsight, we do it very differently from the way that the military has done it in the past or did it back in the old days. And what we do here is we precede our remote viewing with a meditation to calm your mind down so that people can perceive better when they're in a deeply settled state. And then we use procedures that are sort of derived from the military stuff in the sense that it started with that, but they don't look at all like the military stuff now. They're very different. And for those of you who have been following, you know what I'm going to say right now is we have been in direct contact with extraterrestrials for a very long time. I have had extraterrestrial sort of living with me type of long time experiences going back to when I was a kid. And at Farsight, we have meetings with extraterrestrials. We have boardroom meetings with extraterrestrials. We meet with them on the beach, and they have been working with us directly at Farsight. And what they have been doing is, one of the things that they have been doing is giving us changes, modifications, nudgings, whatever you want to call it, in the remote viewing procedure. So our remote viewing procedures don't look like anybody else's because we tried to adapt the military ones, and to be quite honest, I've got a PhD. I'm supposed to be able to come up with new stuff. I couldn't figure out a way to make it better. They told us what to do. We got a lot of information from them. It's sort of like a graduate student professor mentor relationship, and they told us do this, and so on like that. We did have times in the early days at Farsight where we had actually somebody show up and actually give us information. And then now we have, because we've advanced, we've progressed, we now have abilities to be able to communicate with them on their level. And so we have meetings with them, sometimes in exotic, odd locations, sometimes in boardroom meetings. But we have regular interactions with them. Now, we have always talked about there being two groups of extraterrestrials in general. There are many different species and many different groups, but we call the two groups, the main categories, the good ETs and the bad ETs. The bad ETs have formal written agreements with the U.S. government, and they're the ones who are involved in helping the U.S. government come up with a crash retrieval program so that UFOs that are shot down can be retrieved and brought back to places like Area 51, and then the bad ETs give them help in terms of reverse engineering some of the technology. A lot of weapon stuff. The good ETs and the bad ETs have essentially a Cold War going on right now, and the Cold War will turn into a hot war if the bad ETs actually shot the good ETs down. So the bad ETs give the U.S. government in their secret space program tech to have their own ships to be able to shoot down ET crafts, and those are the ones they shoot down. There's only the good ETs, and those are only ones that are sort of seduced or tricked into a vulnerable situation, and then those ETs, those ships are crashed. The crash retrieval program of the American secret space program rushes in, grabs them, and brings them off. Essentially gives the survivors to the bad ETs, where terrible things happen to them, and then so on. So we have, and then they give help with regard to tech transfer with respect to weapons and ship stuff. So the U.S. military and their secret space program has essentially become a lapdog for the bad ETs, a lapdog mercenary force for the bad ETs. The U.S. military is totally split on this, otherwise we wouldn't exist. So part of the U.S. military keeps us alive. They could, the military could squash us in a second. We've been alive and kicking for a very long time, and they keep us alive for two reasons. A good portion of the military values us tremendously, and the proof of this is simply because we still exist. So I'm not going to bring out a general to tell you anything like that. But the other thing is they were curious from the very beginning, because they knew that we were having direct extraterrestrial contacts from the very beginning. We actually got that information from them, that they were fascinated why did this happen. And so for that reason also they have been keeping us alive. So that is why Farsight exists. A good portion of the military wants disclosure to happen. They want all the secrets to be gone. They want the remote viewing secrets to be gone. They want the extraterrestrial contact stuff to be gone. They want the removal of all these major secrets. And the bad ETs have written agreements with the U.S. government to insist that the secrets continue, including, most importantly, the big one, which is that the extraterrestrials even exist. And that's why you have people like David Grush and Lou Elizondo coming out and talking about the secrecy and the reality of the extraterrestrials, and that the U.S. government does in fact have a secret space program that actually is involved in a crash retrieval thing. Actually, they don't talk about the secret space program. They talk about it as a crash retrieval program. And you also have had, in recent days, reported often in News Nation, you have various high-level military people, retired now, talking about it. These are very high-placed military people, colonels and things like that, that are talking openly about this in very prestigious settings, saying there's absolutely, and don't even ask the question, are we alone in the universe? We're obviously not alone, and the U.S. government has these contacts. So the military is very split on this. Part of it wants total secrecy, and part of it wants full disclosure. And so we're sort of on the full disclosure side of this. Well, our remote viewing procedures, which are mental procedures that remote viewers use to perceive across time and space under totally blind conditions. It doesn't even work if you're front-loaded. So they know nothing about a target, nothing about what they're supposed to perceive. They're only told there's a target, go. They do it on their own. They record their videos in an entertaining way. We took a long time to be able to do that. In our studio, and then they present them here, and you can see them on many of the projects are shown on YouTube, but most of the stuff, 99% of everything, the new stuff, especially everything, is on FarsightPrime.com. And we have FarsightPrime.com because we could no longer trust any type of external streaming service like YouTube to be able to keep our stuff up. So we have our own streaming service. And all this costs an awful lot of money for us to do. So that's why we have the streaming service, to be able to pay some of the bills and so on to do this. It's not cheap to be able to do this. Anyway, so we're essentially a remote viewing, in a sense, we're a remote viewing news show. We're a news station. So one of the things we're talking about today is how very different we are from mainstream news. So we're right in the middle of a presidential campaign, and we're also in the middle of the beginning of what's sort of looking like it's developing into almost World War III. We don't really know, but it looks like terrible stuff is going on in the world. And what we see going on right now is that there's absolutely no objectivity in the news. There's nothing that you can see that's on the news. I mean, they'll have stuff in there, what Taylor Swift is doing. You have various things about who's wearing the latest hat and people in sports and stuff like that. And they'll talk about Kamala Harris and they'll talk about Donald Trump. And, you know, you get a very strong bias on the politics of the side, depending on the venue that you're looking at. For example, and I'm not criticizing any venue, it's just that that's how it's evolved. They all have their very strong outlook. CNN has become almost not a formal, but almost a official spokesperson for the venue for the Democratic National Committee, for the Democratic Party. Everything has sort of a very strong pro-liberal Democratic tint to it. Fox News, on the other hand, has a very sort of spokesperson-ish sense for the Republican side of things. So we have the different news sources sort of lining up politically. And they're very, very strong in how they talk about certain things. For example, during the so-called primary season, when the Democratic Party was supposed to be having a primary season, there was no positive information at all, if there was any information at all, about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was trying to run on the Democratic side and couldn't get anything positive out of CNN, and almost nothing at all. Marianne Williamson, who was running also at the time, you couldn't find anything about her on CNN. She actually had a very active campaign running on TikTok. That was the only place that she could get an audience. And she had an enormous level of support among young people who watch TikTok, like 20-30%. It was really big. Yet you couldn't even know that she was running if you just looked at CNN. Fox News, on the other hand, did actually favorably give Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a venue in terms of interviews. They interviewed him a few times and gave him a chance to speak. And now, of course, that the entire political setup has changed. Joe Biden is no longer running, and Kamala Harris is on the Democratic side, and Donald Trump is on the Republican side. And again, you get that extreme polarization in the news, where outlets like CNN are really very, very anti-Trump, and outlets like Fox are very pro-Trump, and outlets like CNN are very pro-Kamala Harris, and outlets like CNN are opposite, not good for Kamala Harris. And this has not actually helped the political process at all, if you're thinking in terms of just democratic thinking. Because, for example, had they had an open primary and had Joe Biden withdrew earlier, Kamala Harris would have actually been able to go through a Democratic primary, very similar to the Republican primary that was actually happening. And the primary season on the Republican side was quite lively. They had a number of debates. On the Democratic side, there was essentially nothing, and the rules were being written up on the Democratic side to prevent any person from actually breaking through. And so, for example, the Joe Biden in 2020, he lost Iowa and he lost New Hampshire, and so they didn't want anyone to actually campaign against Joe Biden in Iowa and New Hampshire, because he could lose, and that could sort of set up a situation like what happened in 1968, when Eugene McCarthy had a very strong showing in New Hampshire, and then soon afterwards, Lyndon Baines Johnson withdrew. The president withdrew from the race. So they didn't want something like that to happen, so they were writing rules all over the place. It was a very undemocratic type of thing that the Democratic Party was doing. But that caused Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to withdraw and to become an independent candidate. So, but what I want to emphasize here is that the news really didn't display all of that. Now, there were some alternate internet news sources that did display that. News Nation and The Hill can be found on YouTube. The Hill and News Nation are linked, but The Hill has the people, the announcers, are younger people. So it's really oriented towards a younger audience. It's got a parallel structure with News Nation, which has older people, like Chris Cuomo and things like that are on News Nation. So, but they tend to actually report a lot more stuff, including stuff about the UFO and extraterrestrial stuff. News Nation heavily covered the David Grush stuff, the congressional hearings and so on. They also covered Lou Elizondo. His stuff came out with News Nation. So these types of things you're getting in the alternate news sources, but you're not really getting it on CNN or other sources of Fox News. A lot of this other stuff is just not happening. So what you're getting from this that I'm telling you now is that the news sources, the mainstream news sources, have real severe biases. Now, the biases come across in the official outlets themselves. Fox News is oriented towards a conservative point of view. CNN is oriented towards a more liberal point of view. But the biases also come across in the reporters, the people who actually do the speaking. They have their biases as well. I have seen terrible things said about various candidates that were not favored by that particular outlet, and just lies were being said. And I've seen this time and time again where the media is manipulating what is being presented in order to keep something, sort of aligned with the way they want the audience to be. And there was a situation where a CNN anchor was actually being interviewed with one of the late night talk show hosts just a week ago, and they mentioned this is Stephen Colbert, and Stephen Colbert show. It was a Stephen Colbert show, and they were talking about CNN, as an objective news source, and the audience laughed. They thought it was like and the CNN anchor, she looked out and said, "Is that a joke? Is that a joke line?" And then Stephen Colbert said, "I guess it is." The point is that people in the audience were simply not accepting that CNN is objective. And it looked like almost Damage Control that Bill Maher in HBO had her in a few days later. It almost looked like Damage Control because they went over this incident and tried to hammer in the idea that CNN is objective. But it's a hard sell. it's a hard sell. But what we want to say is we're not saying anything specific about any particular news outlet is bad or good. I'm just saying that they all have their orientation. They all have a bias. And like the New York Times has a very strong bias against anything dealing with UFOs or extraterrestrials or anything like that. They have a very strong bias on a number of different issues that they treat. Their bias is mostly coming out by simply not reporting things. So, this happens in all of the major venues, not any one particular. So I'm not picking on any one particular. So why is what we do at Farsight different from that? I had to spend some time talking about what you get in the mainstream news, because I'm going to be talking later in this intelligence briefing about stuff you're not getting that you should be getting because it's like really important. But the basic idea is that when we do our studies, all of our projects that you see on FarsightPrime.com, and some of them that are on YouTube, we have fewer on YouTube than on FarsightPrime.com, but all of the studies that we have are always done totally blind. That means that the remote viewers know nothing about the target when they do their sessions. They know nothing about the project. There's no front loading at all whatsoever. Period, full stop, end of story. And so when the remote viewers report what they're doing, they don't know what they're describing. They know what they're perceiving, and they describe that, but they're not told what they're describing until after all the data are collected, including recording everything on video. So you get objectivity with Farsight content.